The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the young woman standing alone at the defendant's table, her hands trembling, her face pale as a ghost. Just moments ago, her lawyer, the man she had trusted with her life, had gathered his files, closed his briefcase, and walked toward the door without looking back. "I cannot continue representing this client," he had said coldly, addressing the judge. "I have been made aware of certain conflicts of interest." And just like that, Emma Turner was abandoned. The opposing counsel, a team of 5 lawyers in expensive suits, exchanged satisfied glances. The plaintiff, a wealthy real estate mogul named Richard Hayes, leaned back in his chair with a smug smile spreading across his face. Victory was already his. Everyone in that room knew it. Emma's knees buckled, but she refused to fall. She gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. This was it. The end of everything she had fought for. The end of the orphanage she had spent 15 years building with her bare hands. The end of the only home those 47 children had ever known. The judge cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Turner, given the circumstances, I can offer you a brief recess to seek alternative representation." "Your Honor," the lead opposing counsel interrupted smoothly, "we object to any further delays. Miss Turner has had 6 months to prepare her defense. This is clearly a tactic to—" "I will defend her!" The voice rang out from the back of the courtroom like thunder. Every head turned toward the doors. A man stood there, tall, commanding, dressed in a simple gray suit that somehow seemed to carry more authority than all the designer labels on the opposing team combined. His dark eyes burned with a fury that made even the security guard step aside as he strode down the center aisle. Richard Hayes shot up from his seat. His face, which had been so confident moments ago, drained of color. What are you doing here?" The judge frowned, clearly recognizing the newcomer. "Mr. Alexander Chen, this is highly irregular. You are not licensed to practice law in this state. You cannot simply—" "I am licensed in 7 states, Your Honor," Alexander replied calmly, reaching into his jacket and producing a folder. "Including this one. I reactivated my license 3 days ago. I am fully qualified to represent Miss Turner, and I am doing so, effective, immediately." He placed the folder on the judge's bench, then turned to face Emma. Their eyes met for the first time, and something passed between them, something neither of them could yet name. She saw kindness in his gaze. He saw courage in hers. "Miss Turner," he said quietly, "I promise you I will not abandon you." Emma wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Who was this man? Why would the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the world suddenly appear in a small-town courtroom to defend a nobody like her? What could he possibly gain from this? But she had learned long ago not to question miracles when they appeared. She simply nodded. Alexander Chen turned to face the opposing counsel, and there was something terrifying in his smile. "Gentlemen," he said, "shall we begin? To understand what happened in that courtroom, and why it changed everything, we need to go back 23 years, to a rainy night in October when a baby girl was left on the steps of St. Mary's Orphanage with nothing but a thin blanket and a note that read, 'Please forgive me.' That baby was Emma Turner. She never knew her parents, never knew why they had left her. The sisters at St. Mary's tried their best to fill that void, but there were too many children and too few resources. By the time Emma was 6 years old, she had already learned that if she wanted something in this world, she would have to fight for it herself. And fight she did. She was not the prettiest child nor the most charming. She did not have the sparkling personality that attracted adoptive parents during their visits. What Emma had was something else, a quiet determination that burned in her chest like an eternal flame. While other children played, Emma studied. While others dreamed, Emma planned. By 16, she had earned a full scholarship to the State University. By 22, she had completed her degree in social work with honors. And by 24, she had returned to St. Mary's with a single purpose: to save it, The orphanage was dying. Funding had been cut year after year. The building was crumbling. The sisters who had raised her were aging, unable to keep up with the demands of caring for dozens of children. The state had given them an ultimatum: fix the building's safety violations within 1 year, or the orphanage would be shut down and the children scattered to foster homes across the state. Emma refused to let that happen. She took over the management of St. Mary's. She worked 18-hour days writing grant applications, organizing fundraisers, begging local businesses for donations. She learned plumbing from YouTube videos to fix the broken pipes herself. She climbed onto the roof in the middle of winter to patch the leaks because they could not afford a contractor. She went without meals so the children could eat. Slowly, impossibly, St. Mary's began to heal. The safety violations were addressed one by one. New programs were established. The children, who had been so afraid, so broken, began to smile again. Emma became more than a director to them. She became a mother, a sister, a friend. She read them bedtime stories every night, helped them with their homework, held them when they cried. She gave them what she had never had: someone who would not leave. For 10 years, Emma poured every ounce of her being into St. Mary's. She never married, never dated, never took a vacation. The orphanage was her life, and the children were her family. And then Richard Hayes arrived. Richard Hayes was not a man who was accustomed to hearing the word no. He had built his real estate empire by acquiring land that others considered worthless and transforming it into luxury developments. He had a gift for seeing potential where others saw nothing. More importantly, he had a gift for making problems disappear, legally or otherwise. When Richard set his sights on the block where St. Mary's Orphanage stood, he saw gold. The neighborhood had been gentrifying rapidly. Property values had tripled in 5 years. The orphanage's land, 3 acres of prime real estate in the heart of the city, was worth more than $40 million. He made Emma an offer, $15 million for the property. She could use the money to relocate the orphanage to a new building somewhere else. Everyone would win. Emma refused. Richard doubled his offer, $30 million. It was more money than Emma had ever dreamed of, more than enough to build a new facility, hire staff, endow the orphanage for the next century. Emma refused again. "This is their home," she told him, standing in the modest office she had carved out of a former supply closet. "These children have already lost so much. I will not take away the only stability they have ever known. I will not make them start over in a strange place, surrounded by strangers. This building, these walls, this garden, it is all they have. And I will not sell it." Richard stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. In his world, everyone had a price. Everyone could be bought. The idea that this unremarkable woman in her thrift store clothes would reject $30 million, it was incomprehensible. "You are making a mistake," he said quietly. "I always get what I want, Miss Turner. Always. You can take my money and walk away with your dignity, or you can fight me and lose everything. There is no third option." Emma looked him in the eye. "Then I will fight," Richard smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. So be it. What followed was a nightmare. Richard Hayes had resources that Emma could not even imagine. He hired investigators to dig into every aspect of her life, looking for dirt. When they found nothing, he created some. Suddenly, anonymous complaints were being filed with the state licensing board, accusing St. Mary's of safety violations that did not exist. Inspectors began showing up unannounced, finding problems that had never been there before. The orphanage's funding sources, the grants Emmanuel had worked so hard to secure, began drying up one by one as donors received mysterious phone calls warning them that St. Mary's was under investigation. Then came the lawsuit. Richard Hayes sued St. Mary's Orphanage for $20 million, claiming that the orphanage's activities had caused environmental contamination of his adjacent property. The claim was absurd. St. Mary's was a children's home, not a chemical plant. But that did not matter. The lawsuit was never meant to succeed in court. It was meant to destroy Emma through the process itself. Legal fees, court dates, depositions, discovery requests. The lawsuit consumed every minute of Emma's time and every penny of the orphanage's dwindling resources. She could not afford a real lawyer, so she found one who agreed to work on contingency, a young attorney named Michael Graves, who said he wanted to help the little guy fight back against corporate greed. Emma trusted him. She told him everything. She gave him access to all of St. Mary's financial records, all of her personal information, every document that might be relevant to the case. She did not know that Michael Graves was already on Richard Hayes's payroll. The morning of the trial, Emma arrived at the courthouse with a folder full of evidence and a heart full of hope. She had spent months preparing for this moment. She had documented every false claim, every manufactured complaint, every lie that Richard Hayes had told. She had letters from the children she had raised, now grown, testifying to the orphanage's impact on their lives. She had medical records proving that the so-called environmental contamination had never made anyone sick. She had everything she needed to prove that this lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to steal her home through legal bullying. But when she entered the courtroom, Michael Graves was not at the defendant's table. She found him in the hallway, talking quietly with Richard Hayes. When he saw her approaching, he turned away quickly, but not before Emma caught the flash of bills being exchanged between them. Her lawyer, the man she had trusted, was shaking hands with her enemy. Emma's blood turned to ice. "Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what is this?" He could not meet her eyes. "I am sorry, Emma, I really am. But they made me an offer I could not refuse. My student loans, my mother's medical bills. I needed the money. I am sure you understand." "Understand?" Emma's voice cracked. "You were supposed to help me. Those children are counting on me." "Those children are not my problem." Michael straightened his tie, finally looking at her. There was no guilt in his eyes, only cold calculation. "And neither are you. Not anymore. Good luck in there, Miss Turner. You are going to need it." He walked past her into the courtroom, and when the judge asked if both parties were ready to proceed, Michael Graves stood up and announced that he could no longer represent Emma Turner due to irreconcilable conflicts of interest. The opposing counsel smiled. Richard Hayes smiled. The judge looked uncomfortable, but said nothing, and Emma stood alone. That was the moment when everything should have ended. That was the moment when Richard Hayes should have won, when the orphanage should have been lost, when 47 children should have become homeless. That was the moment when Alexander Chen walked through the doors. Alexander Chen was not supposed to be in that courtroom. He was supposed to be in Tokyo, closing a $2 billion merger that would expand his technology company into the Asian market. He was supposed to be in meetings all day, reviewing contracts, shaking hands with investors, doing all the things that the CEO of a Fortune 500 company was expected to do. Instead, he was here, in a small courtroom in a city he had never visited, defending a woman he had never met, for reasons that even he did not fully understand. It had started 3 days ago, with a newspaper. Alexander rarely read newspapers. He got his information from digital sources, real-time feeds, curated summaries prepared by his assistant. But on that morning, his flight from San Francisco to Tokyo had been delayed due to mechanical issues, and he had found himself stuck in an airport lounge with nothing but a stack of local papers to pass the time. He picked one up at random, a small regional publication from a city he had never heard of. And there on page 7 was a photograph of a woman standing in front of an old brick building surrounded by children. Local orphanage fights to survive as billionaire lawsuit threatens closure. Alexander stared at the photograph. Something about it tugged at his memory, something he could not quite place. The building looked familiar, though he was certain he had never seen it before. The children's faces reminded him of something painful, something he had spent decades trying to forget. He read the article, then He read it again and again. By the time he had finished reading for the fourth time, his hands were shaking. "Cancel Tokyo," he told his assistant. "Sir, cancel everything. Book me a flight to this city now." "Mr. Chen, the merger—" "I said now." His assistant had worked for Alexander for 12 years. She had never heard that tone in his voice before. She did not ask any more questions. There was a reason why Alexander Chen reacted the way he did to that article. There was a reason why the sight of an orphanage, any orphanage, made his chest tighten with emotions he could not name. There was a reason why he had spent his entire adult life building a fortune only to give most of it away to children's charities around the world. Alexander Chen had once been an orphan himself. He did not remember much about his early childhood. Fragments of memory like broken glass, a woman's voice singing a lullaby in a language he no longer understood, the smell of burning wood, screaming, running through a forest in the dark, someone carrying him, then putting him down and telling him to hide. The sound of gunfire, silence. He was found 3 days later by a United Nations refugee patrol, wandering alone near the border of a war-torn country that no longer existed. He was approximately 4 years old. He did not know his name, his nationality, or what had happened to his family. He did not speak any language that the relief workers recognized. They brought him to a refugee camp, then to an orphanage, then to another orphanage, then to a foster home, then to another foster home. He bounced through the system like a pinball, never landing anywhere for long. Some of the places were kind, some were not. He learned to trust no one, to rely only on himself, to hide his intelligence because being smart made you a target. At 15, he was placed with a foster family in the United States. For the first time in his life, he got lucky. They were good people, not rich, not perfect, but good. They encouraged him to study. They believed in him when no one else did. They helped him apply for scholarships, helped him navigate a system that seemed designed to keep people like him down. He went to college, then graduate school. Then he started a company in a garage with 3 friends and an idea that everyone said was impossible. 10 years later, that company was worth $50 billion, and Alexander Chen was one of the wealthiest men in the world. But he had never forgotten where he came from. He had never forgotten the feeling of being abandoned, of being alone, of having no one to fight for him when it mattered most. And when he saw that photograph in the newspaper, when he read about a woman who had devoted her entire life to protecting children who had no one else, something inside him broke open. He had to help her. He did not know why. He did not know how. He only knew that he could not let her fight alone. Alexander arrived in the city the night before the trial. He went straight to St. Mary's Orphanage, but Emma was not there. The children were being looked after by volunteers, and they told him that Miss Emma had been at the courthouse all day, preparing. He could have waited. He could have approached her before the trial, introduced himself, offered his help like a normal person. But something told him to wait. Something told him that he needed to see for himself what she was up against. He needed to witness the full extent of the injustice before he could fight it. So he sat in the back of the courtroom the next morning watching. He watched Richard Hayes arrive with his army of lawyers. He watched Emma Turner walk in alone, her shoulders straight, despite the fear in her eyes. He watched Michael Graves betray her without a moment's hesitation. And when Emma stood there, abandoned and alone, facing the end of everything she had built, Alexander could not stay silent any longer. "Objection, Your Honor!" Alexander's voice rang out again, this time in response to something the opposing counsel had said. It was only the third objection he had raised in the past hour, but each one had been surgical, precise, devastating. On what grounds? The lead opposing counsel demanded. His name was Gregory Stone, and he was considered one of the best litigators in the state. He was not accustomed to being challenged by someone who had not practiced law in over a decade. On the grounds that the witness is testifying to matters outside his area of expertise, Alexander replied calmly, "Dr. Peterson is a soil scientist. He has no qualifications to speak about the health effects of alleged contaminants. If Mr. Hayes's counsel wishes to introduce medical evidence, they should call a medical expert." The judge nodded slowly. Sustained. The jury will disregard Dr. Peterson's last statement about health effects. Gregory Stone's jaw tightened. That was the third piece of his case that Alexander had dismantled, and the trial had barely begun. Emma watched from the defendant's table, hardly daring to breathe. She still did not understand what was happening or why this stranger had appeared to save her. But as she watched him work, she began to feel something she had not felt in months: hope. Alexander Chen was not just a CEO playing lawyer. He was brilliant. He moved through the courtroom like he had been born there, anticipating every argument before it was made, finding weaknesses in testimony that Emma had not noticed despite reading the same depositions 100 times. He spoke to the jury like they were friends, making complex legal concepts simple and understandable. He treated every witness with respect, even the hostile ones, which made their lies seem even more obvious in contrast to his calm, reasonable demeanor. But it was more than just skill. There was a passion in his voice that went beyond professional interest. When he spoke about the children at St. Mary's, his eyes shone with an intensity that could not be faked. When he described the length to which Richard Hayes had gone to destroy the orphanage, there was real anger in his words. He cared, genuinely cared. And the jury could see it. The trial lasted 3 days. On the first day, Alexander methodically dismantled the environmental contamination claim. He brought in his own experts, some of the best scientists in the country who had flown in overnight as a personal favor to Alexander, and they testified that there was no contamination whatsoever on Richard Hayes's property. More importantly, they revealed that the evidence of contamination that Hayes's team had presented was actually from samples taken at a completely different location, miles away from St. Mary's. The jury looked at Richard Hayes with new eyes after that. On the second day, Alexander called Michael Graves to the stand. The former lawyer tried to refuse, but he had no legal grounds. He squirmed in the witness chair as Alexander calmly, methodically exposed every detail of his betrayal. The secret payments from Richard Hayes, the confidential information he had shared with the opposing side, the deliberate sabotage of Emma's defense. "Mr. Graves," Alexander said quietly, "when you agreed to represent Miss Turner, did you inform her of your financial relationship with Mr. Hayes?" I didn't have a financial relationship at that time." "But you knew you were going to be offered one, didn't you? Isn't it true that Mr. Hayes's representatives contacted you before you even agreed to take Miss Turner's case?" Michael's face went pale. I don't recall." Alexander produced a folder. "Perhaps these phone records will refresh your memory. According to these documents, you received 17 calls from Hayes Development Corporation in the 2 weeks before you agreed to represent St. Mary's Orphanage. Would you like to explain those calls, Mr. Graves?" Michael said nothing. He did not need to. The truth was written all over his face. On the third day, Alexander called his final witness, Emma Turner herself. Emma walked to the witness stand with trembling legs. She had never been afraid of public speaking. She had addressed crowds of hundreds at fundraising events, testified before state committees, given interviews to newspapers and television stations. But this was different. This was everything. Alexander approached her gently. "Miss Turner, can you tell the court why you refused to sell St. Mary's Orphanage to Mr. Hayes?" Emma took a deep breath. "Because it is not mine to sell." "Can you explain what you mean by that?" "St. Mary's Orphanage does not belong to me. It belongs to the children who live there. It belongs to the generations of children who have grown up within those walls, who have found safety and love and hope in a place that the rest of the world forgot about. It belongs to every volunteer who has ever given their time, every donor who has ever given their money, every sister who has devoted her life to caring for the unwanted. Emma's voice grew stronger as she spoke. When I was a baby, someone left me on the steps of that orphanage with nothing but a blanket and a note. I never knew my parents. I never knew where I came from or why I was abandoned. But the sisters at St. Mary's took me in. They gave me a home. They taught me that every child deserves to be loved, regardless of where they come from or what their circumstances are. She looked directly at the jury. There are 47 children living at St. Mary's right now. Some of them have been abused. Some of them have been abandoned. Some of them have nowhere else to go. If this lawsuit succeeds, if the orphanage is forced to close, those children will be scattered across the state, separated from the only family they have ever known. Some of them may never recover. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. I have dedicated my entire life to those children. I have gone without food so they could eat. I have gone without sleep so they could have bedtime stories. I have given up everything, to keep them safe. And I will not let a rich man, who has never known a day of suffering in his life, take away the only home they have. The courtroom was silent. Several members of the jury were wiping their eyes. Alexander nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Turner. No further questions." Gregory Stone approached the witness stand with a predatory smile. He had been practicing law for 30 years, and he had never lost a case against an unrepresented defendant. He was not about to start now. "Miss Turner," he began, "you claim to care so deeply about these children. Yet isn't it true that you have been romantically involved with Mr. Chen, who has significant financial interests that would be affected by the outcome of this case?" "Objection!" Alexander was on his feet. "There is no foundation for this question, and counsel is attempting to introduce prejudicial speculation." "Sustained," the judge said firmly. "Mr. Stone, confine your questions to relevant matters." Gregory's smile flickered, but he pressed on. "Miss Turner, isn't it true that the orphanage has accumulated significant debts under your management?" "Yes," Emma said quietly. "We have debts. Running a nonprofit organization is not easy, especially when powerful people are trying to destroy you." "And isn't it true that if you sold the property to Mr. Hayes, those debts would be eliminated and you would personally profit from the sale?" "Objection," Alexander said again. "Miss Turner has already testified that she has never taken a salary from St. Mary's. There is no personal profit at issue here." "Sustained?" Gregory's face was turning red. Every angle of attack he tried was being blocked. He decided to change tactics. "Miss Turner, you testified that you were abandoned as an infant and raised at St. Mary's. Isn't it possible that your judgment is clouded by personal sentiment? That you are placing your own emotional attachment above the best interests of the children?" Emma looked at him steadily. "Mr. Stone, I have spent every day for the past 15 years putting the children's interests above my own. I know every child at St. Mary's by name. I know their favorite foods, their favorite books, their nightmares, and their dreams. I know which ones need extra hugs at bedtime and which ones need space to work through their feelings. I have held their hands when they were scared. I have celebrated their birthdays when no one else remembered. I have fought for them when no one else would." Her voice dropped. "What do you know about these children, Mr. Stone? Have you ever met any of them? Have you ever looked into their eyes and promised them that they would be safe? No. You are here because a wealthy man is paying you to destroy their home. So please do not lecture me about what is in their best interests." The silence that followed was deafening. Gregory Stone had no more questions. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood and faced the judge. "We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, St. Mary's Orphanage, on all counts. Furthermore, we recommend that the plaintiff be ordered to pay all legal costs incurred by the defendant, as well as damages for malicious prosecution." The courtroom erupted. Emma collapsed into her chair, sobbing with relief. The children's volunteers in the gallery, cheered and hugged each other. The reporters in the back row scrambled for their phones. Richard Hayes sat frozen in his seat, his face a mask of disbelief. This was not how things were supposed to end. He always won. He always got what he wanted. How had this happened? Alexander Chen walked over to Emma and gently helped her to her feet. She looked up at him through her tears. "I do not understand," she whispered. "Why did you do this? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything. Why would you give up everything, your business, your time, your reputation, to help a stranger?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Because 30 years ago I was one of those children." Emma stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I was an orphan, Miss Turner. I was abandoned in a war zone when I was 4 years old. I do not remember my parents. I do not know my real name. I spent my childhood being shuffled from one institution to another, always alone, always afraid. No one ever fought for me. No one ever stood up and said, 'This child matters.'" He looked out at the courtroom, at the celebrating supporters, at the defeated faces of Richard Hayes's legal team. "When I read about what you were doing, how you had dedicated your entire life to protecting children who had no one else, I saw myself. I saw what my life could have been if someone like you had been there for me, and I knew that I could not let you fight alone, not when I had the power to help." Emma reached out and took his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for everything." Alexander smiled, a real smile, the first one she had seen from him since he walked into the courtroom 3 days ago. "Do not thank me yet. We still have work to do." But the trial was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the truth about Richard Hayes began to emerge. The jury's finding of malicious prosecution opened the door to a full investigation into his business practices. Journalists who had been afraid to touch the story suddenly found their courage. Former employees came forward with evidence of fraud, bribery, and intimidation. The state attorney general opened a criminal investigation. Within 3 months, Richard Hayes was indicted on 14 counts of racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. His empire crumbled. His partners abandoned him. His wife filed for divorce. The man who had seemed untouchable was finally being held accountable for decades of wrongdoing. Michael Graves was disbarred. The State Bar Association found him guilty of multiple ethics violations, including conflict of interest, breach of fiduciary duty, and accepting bribes. He lost his license to practice law in any state. The last anyone heard, he was working as a used car salesman in a small town, far from anywhere, living with the weight of what he had done. And Emma Turner? Emma Turner became a hero. Her story spread across the country and around the world. Donations poured into St. Mary's Orphanage from every corner of the globe. The 47 children who had nearly lost their home became ambassadors of hope, their faces appearing on magazine covers and television programs. The old brick building that had almost been demolished was renovated, expanded, modernized, a palace of hope rising from the ashes of injustice. But the greatest change was not in the orphanage. It was in Emma herself. 6 months after the trial, Emma received a phone call. "Miss Turner, this is Detective Sandra Williams from the State Bureau of Investigation. We have been reviewing evidence seized from Richard Hayes's offices, and we found something we think you should see." Emma drove to the state capitol that afternoon. Detective Williams met her in a conference room filled with boxes of documents. "We were going through Hayes's personal files," the detective explained, "and we found this." She handed Emma a manila folder. Inside were yellowed documents, photographs, and a handwritten letter. Emma's hand shook as she read. The letter was dated 23 years ago, the night Emma was born. It was written by a woman named Sarah Chen, addressed to her brother, a man named James Chen. "James," the letter read, "I am leaving the baby at St. Mary's tonight. Please forgive me. I know this is the only way to keep her safe. Richard Hayes will never stop looking for her. He will never stop trying to take her from me. The only way to protect her is to make sure he never finds her. I have given her a new name, Emma Turner. Turner was Mother's maiden name. Please watch over her from a distance. Please make sure she is safe. And please never tell her about me. If she knows, she will be in danger. I love her more than anything in this world. That is why I have to let her go. Your sister, Sarah. Emma stared at the letter until the words blurred. Her mother, her real mother. After 23 years, she finally had a name. We did some research, Detective Williams said gently. Sarah Chen died 2 years after she wrote this letter. She was involved in a legal dispute with Richard Hayes over property that belonged to her family. Hayes wanted that property, the same land that St. Mary's now stands on. When Sarah refused to sell, things got ugly. She went into hiding, but Hayes's people found her. Emma looked up, horror dawning on her face. He killed her? We cannot prove that. The official cause of death was a car accident. But now that we are looking at Hayes with new eyes, we are reopening the investigation. Emma's mind was reeling. But the letter mentions her brother, James Chen. What happened to him? Detective Williams hesitated. That is the other thing we found, Miss Turner. James Chen changed his name after his sister died. He went into witness protection. He eventually moved to the United States, was adopted by a foster family, and went on to build a technology company. Emma's heart stopped. What name did he take? Alexander Chen. The revelation shattered everything Emma thought she knew. Alexander, the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to save her, was her uncle, her mother's brother. The man who had watched over her from a distance for her entire life, just as Sarah had asked. She found him standing in the garden at St. Mary's, watching the children play. When she approached, he did not turn around. He already knew what she had learned. You knew, she said softly. All this time, you knew who I was. Yes, Alexander admitted. I have known since the day you were born. Sarah made me promise to keep my distance, to protect you by staying away. She was afraid that if Hayes ever discovered the connection between us, he would use me to find you. But you came anyway. When I was in trouble, you came. I could not stay away any longer. Alexander finally turned to face her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. For 20 years, I watched from a distance. I funded the orphanage anonymously. I made sure the building was maintained. I pulled strings behind the scenes to keep you safe. But when I saw that article, when I realized that Hayes was finally going to win, I knew I had to act. I could not let him destroy the last piece of my sister that remained in this world. Emma was crying now, too. Why did you not tell me? After the trial, why did you not say anything? Because I wanted you to know me as a person first, not as a long-lost relative appearing out of nowhere with a claim on your life. I wanted to earn your trust. I wanted to show you who I was before I told you who we are to each other. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. You have your mother's eyes, her strength, her compassion. She would be so proud of what you have become, Emma. So incredibly proud. Emma threw her arms around him and held on tight. For the first time in her life, she was not alone. She had a family. She had a history. She had answers to questions she had carried for as long as she could remember, and she had someone who would never abandon her. The story of Emma Turner and Alexander Chen became legend. Books were written about them. Movies were made. Their faces appeared on the covers of magazines and newspapers around the world. They became symbols of hope, proof that even the most powerful bullies could be defeated if someone was willing to stand up and fight. But for Emma, the real reward was much simpler. Every night, she still walked through the halls of St. Mary's Orphanage, checking on the children, making sure they were safe. Every night, she still read bedtime stories and sang lullabies and promised them that they would always have a home. And now, sometimes, her uncle walked with her. He would sit in the corner and watch as she tucked the children in, a look of wonder on his face. He was learning what it meant to be part of a family. He was discovering a joy he had never allowed himself to feel. One evening, a little girl named Lily, the newest arrival at St. Mary's, looked up at Emma with big, curious eyes. "Miss Emma," she asked, "why do you work so hard for us? Why do you do everything for children you did not even know?" Emma smiled and knelt down beside her bed. "Because a long time ago, when I was just a baby, someone did the same thing for me. Someone sacrificed everything so I could be safe. And the best way I can say thank you is to do the same for others." Lily thought about this for a moment. Like paying it forward? Exactly like paying it forward. The little girl smiled and snuggled deeper under her blanket. "When I grow up, I want to be just like you, Miss Emma." Emma's heart swelled with love. She kissed the little girl's forehead and whispered, "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." Years passed. The orphanage flourished. Children grew up and went on to build lives of their own, as doctors, teachers, artists, and parents. They never forgot where they came from. They never forgot the woman who had given them everything. Alexander Chen stepped back from his company and devoted himself to philanthropy. He founded the Sarah Chen Foundation, named after his sister, which built orphanages and children's homes in over 50 countries. He spent his remaining years making sure that no child would ever feel as alone as he had felt growing up. And Richard Hayes? Richard Hayes spent the rest of his life in prison, haunted by the faces of everyone he had wronged. His fortune was seized and distributed to his victims. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when greed consumes the soul. But this story was never really about Richard Hayes. It was never about villains or courtrooms or legal battles. It was about a single moment, a moment when someone who had the power to look away chose instead to stand up and say 3 simple words, "I will defend her." Those words changed everything. They saved an orphanage. They reunited a family. They brought a tyrant to justice. They showed the world that money and power are no match for courage and love. And they proved what Emma had always believed, that no one is truly alone. Somewhere out there, there is always someone willing to fight for you. You just have to hold on long enough for them to find you. The sun was setting over St. Mary's Orphanage, painting the old brick building in shades of gold and rose. Children were running through the garden, their laughter echoing off the walls that had sheltered generations of the forgotten and the lost. Emma stood at the window, watching them. She was older now, gray in her hair, lines on her face, a quiet strength in her eyes that came from a lifetime of fighting for others. Alexander stood beside her, leaning on a cane. His health was failing, but his spirit remained unbroken. They watched the children together, uncle and niece, 2 souls who had found each other against impossible odds. "Do you ever think about what might have happened?" Alexander asked quietly. "If I had not walked into that courtroom?" Emma shook her head. "No, because you did walk in. That is all that matters. But what if I had not seen that newspaper? What if my flight had not been delayed? There were so many chances for things to go differently." Emma turned to look at him. "Then someone else would have come. I truly believe that. When you dedicate your life to protecting others, the universe finds a way to protect you in return. Maybe it would not have been you, maybe it would have been someone else, but someone would have come." Alexander smiled. "You have more faith than I do. I have seen more miracles than you have." They watched the children play until the last light faded from the sky. Then Emma helped her uncle inside, and they joined the children for dinner in the great hall that had once been on the verge of demolition. 47 children had grown to over 200, and the old building had been expanded to accommodate them all. But the heart of St. Mary's remained unchanged, a place where every child was wanted, every child was loved, every child had a home. As Emma took her seat at the head of the long table, surrounded by the extended family she had built over a lifetime, she felt her mother's presence watching over her. Sarah Chen had sacrificed everything to keep her daughter safe, and now that sacrifice was bearing fruit in ways she could never have imagined. 100 faces looked back at Emma with love and trust, 100 stories of redemption and hope, 100 futures that had been saved by one woman's refusal to give up. "I will defend her," Alexander had said on that day in the courtroom. And he had. They all had. Every volunteer, every donor, every supporter who had believed in St. Mary's mission. Together they had built something beautiful from the ashes of injustice. Emma raised her glass. "To family," she said. "To the ones we are born with and the ones we choose. To the children who teach us courage and the strangers who become heroes. And to the simple truth that love in the end always wins." 200 voices echoed her words. 200 glasses clinked together. And somewhere, in a place beyond the reach of time and sorrow, a mother smiled down at the daughter she had saved and the extraordinary life that had blossomed from her sacrifice. The story of St. Mary's Orphanage did not end that night. It continues still in every child who finds a home within its walls, in every life that is transformed by its love. It is written in the laughter of children and the tears of the grateful, in the courage of those who fight for the forgotten, and the grace of those who refuse to give up. It is a story that proves the most powerful words in any language are not about money or power or fame. They are simply this: I will defend her, and someone always will.